Everyone to please find their seats, turn their phones on to silence mode, and let me welcome everyone. Auburn University is thrilled and delighted to be hosting today's event. At the university, we've got a ton of activity along the lines of GPS, PNT, positioning, navigation, and timing, as well as obviously broader critical infrastructure work, and delighted to have Professor Dave Beverly up in DC with us today. But it's also a great opportunity to hear from the Department of Homeland Security in terms of the official guidance for the GPS rollover, which I'm sure you're all aware occurs on 6 April. I think there's also a good news story here in terms of all the activity from an interagency perspective, and we'll hear from many of them today on a panel discussion, as well as from industry in terms of how you've seen a public-private partnership and collaborative effort that has gone beyond the aspirational nouns and actually got into the verbs, which is what we like to see, getting stuff done. For anyone who doesn't appreciate the importance of timing and signaling, anyone who's a parent, how many times have you heard, what time is it? How many times have you heard, are we there yet? As a father of 4, I can tell you I've heard that millions of times. Well, that's why time is so important. GPS is obviously ubiquitous in all of the functioning of our critical infrastructure, of our economy, of our national security and public safety. But one of the things I really want to zero in on is building time resilience, because I think when you look at critical infrastructures, not all critical infrastructures are equally critical, but there are cross-cutting functionality issues that are so important to our country, and clearly timing PNT and the growing significance of space is at the top of the list. I have the privilege to introduce our keynote this morning, Bob Kolasky, who is the director of one of the newest agencies in Washington, the CISA, the Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security, and one of the newest offices in terms of national risk management. So Bob is ideally situated to discuss these issues. He's been a longtime friend. He's no stranger to cybersecurity, to the Department of Homeland Security, and to any of these issues, and absolutely privileged to be able to have him here today, and he'll give you a little rundown on the official guidance, also what the department's doing to gear up for some of this, and then he and I will have a quick fireside chat, and then we're going to turn it over to Cheri, Caddy, one of our senior fellows here, who will lead a panel of subject matter experts on the topic. So good morning, welcome Bob Kolasky. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank, and it's great to be here at Auburn at GW. I thought Frank had a great idea. Frank and Cheri had a great idea when they suggested we do this event around the GPS Week rollover, which we'll be talking about throughout the rest of the morning. I hope what you would take from the GPS Week rollover conversation is this is a moment where our timing systems are going to be tested a little bit, that it is a moment where we should be focusing on the importance of timing in everything we do, and certainly in everything that critical infrastructure does, but is not a moment of enhanced risk. It's not a moment where security considerations should be amplified past the point of reasonableness. It's something that we as a community, everyone who relies on timing needs to be prepared for, but as Frank said, I think there's a good preparedness and resilience already out there around the week rollover. We'll talk a little bit about what we're doing at DHS, some of the messages we're getting out there, but I wanted to take this instead, not just to focus on what's going to happen on April 6th, but put it in the overall context of our national risk management efforts, for critical infrastructure, and why position navigation timing and making sure we have secure and resilient position navigation timing services that we can rely on as a country, that our critical infrastructure, that our government can rely on, are so important to the nation's critical infrastructure strategy. So with that in mind, I thought I'd take the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're doing within the National Risk Management Center as part of the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency within the context of this conversation. When Secretary Nielsen launched the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, the National Risk Management Center and the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency in August of last year, she did so with three big ideas in mind. And I think as we talk about P&T, we should keep those three big ideas in mind. One of which is we need to take a more strategic approach to how we prioritize and think about making our country's critical infrastructure more secure, how we prioritize making it more resilient. It is a moment that we live in right now where nation states, our potential adversaries, are looking at critical infrastructure as a potential target area or as a target area to achieve their own strategic effects. And when I say this, it doesn't take me very long to get to the reporting and things you've seen around countries like Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, in particularly with activity around cyberspace, where you see countries who have geopolitical aims that are counter to the US geopolitical aims, looking at critical infrastructure as a potential area to cause strategic harm to us as a country. With that in mind, we as a country have to think about critical infrastructure security and resilience as a strategic aim. We have to be more focused on what are the things that are most important that we as a country produce via our critical infrastructure that need to be functioning, the services we rely on, the networks that we need, and we need to make sure that they're secure. If our adversaries may be looking at things that they can do to those systems, we need to be looking harder at things we need to do to protect those systems. And so recognizing the threat environment that we live in, particularly as it pertains to things that can be done via cyberspace, we recognize let's take our critical infrastructure approach and elevate it to a strategic area of importance. You see this conversation in the National Cybersecurity Strategy that came out around the same time last year. You see it in the National Defense Strategy. It's part of the National Security Strategy. The National Risk Management Center was DHS's attempt to make that, or is DHS's contribution to make that part of our overall programs and doctrine of which what we'll do as the department to protect the nation's critical infrastructure. So with strategic in mind, the second thing that sort of underpinned the establishment of the National Risk Management Center was the idea that if you think about risk from that perspective, it quickly gets you to things that are cross-sector. Those of you who've been working in infrastructure policy for a long time are familiar with the traditional sector-by-sector structure of critical infrastructure. There's the energy sector, there's the water sector, there's the banking and finance sector, transportation sector, on down the line. We started with an approach as a country with building information sharing arrangements, understanding public-private partnerships, and understanding vulnerability management at the sector level. We've made a lot of progress in the last 15 years in those areas, but what we then exposed in doing that work, that there are some things that transcend that sector structure that were not easily dealt with by the partnerships and the relationships we stood up, and we needed some dedicated focus on cross-sector issues. One of those cross-sector issues, obviously, since I'm here talking about, is position and navigation timing service. I'll talk a little more in depth there. But we wanted to break down any silos that were created by the sector structure and work cross-sector issues. And then the third area that was important is something that's really near and dear to my heart, which is this idea, and why we're called a National Risk Management Center is because we are a center of activity where government and industry come together to work strategic issues, come together to come up with strategic risk mitigation solutions to deal with the strategic challenges that I laid out. So it's not, the center idea is not a business as usual idea. What it is the ability to pull from different parts of government, whether it's my colleagues from the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the Department of Treasury, other parts of government, and industry representing some of the biggest players, in terms of critical infrastructure owners and operators, some of the biggest companies out there, and organizations that represent those companies, but also have the ability to pull in small and medium-sized businesses appropriate to work issues collectively to come up with a set of risk mitigation solutions that will address things that will make us as a country more secure. That was the idea behind the National Risk Management Center. We are now about 8 months into that, and I think so far it's borne out that the idea was both a good one. I know that because the feedback I've gotten, that the enthusiasm 8 months in is the same as it was on day one, and perhaps even higher. I know it by the fact how much time I spend with my interagency colleagues, how much time I spend with my industry colleagues. I know it by the issues that we've been asked to take on, the issues that we're already taking on, that this is the right way to go about securing the country. It cannot only be agency by agency, sector by sector, or government first and industry come along for the ride. It has to be a partnership from the get-go. So that was the premise in which we were operating, and with that premise in mind, we had to come up with some concepts to operationalize that premise. And one of the early concepts we came up with was this idea of national critical functions. What are the critical functions that infrastructure produces that are so essential to the nation's well-being, be it our ability to execute national power, our economic competitiveness, the ability for communities to be secure, the ability to secure our populace, that absolutely need to work. We cannot afford to be degraded at a scale level by our enemies. So what are the most important things that critical infrastructure produces? And let's define them in terms of functions. Let's get out of defining which sector is more important than which other sector, but what is it the thing that infrastructure produces that we absolutely need to work? Doesn't, you know, it's sort of a bit of a paradigm shift as we think about critical infrastructure prioritization. So with the National Critical Functions model in mind, we've worked through a process over the last 6 or 7 months to really try to come up with a core set of national critical functions that are absolutely essential, that are produced by critical infrastructure. We are in the final stages of that process. Right now we have roughly a little more than 5 dozen national critical functions identified. Those are functions that have been identified working with sector structure, working with interagency colleagues and experts, understanding the things that infrastructure produces that are most important. It's not a super surprising list in the sense that, when I tell you that the things that are most important that are linked to the electric sector are the ability to generate electricity and transmit electricity and distribute electricity, that's not going to surprise anyone that's why we care about electricity. In terms of transportation, the ability to move goods and people via air, the ability to move goods and people via train. In terms of water, the ability to have water on demand to perform both for potable water and to perform emergency services where water is dependent on. Those are the kind of things that are going to end up on when we release a set of national critical functions. But when you take a functional approach, what you quickly understand that the ability for any one of those functions to work depends on more than any one sector. Even when you're talking about generating electricity, it depends not just on the ability of the electric companies to do what they need to do. It's the transportation of things to get things to support generating electricity. It's the need for communications. It's need for the water to keep systems cool. So you quickly understand, and if you've ever lived through sort of a disaster response and trying to put a community back together, you quickly understand the dependencies and interdependencies in the ability to produce things that infrastructure depends on. So with the set of national critical functions, what we intend to do is release that publicly to guide future prioritization of risk management activities, to continue to push toward really putting as much focus as possible on the things that infrastructure produces that are most important, and then begin to do additional scenario and risk analysis and dependency analysis on, is there a feasible scenario where an adversary can degrade that function to a level that's unacceptable from a risk perspective? And that's kind of going to be our risk management approach. What's the scenario and what's the likelihood and consequences of the scenario happening where degradation is something that we can't stand for as a nation because it impedes our ability to do things that are really important. We can't stand for it at a community level, which is really important to a governor or a mayor. And we can't stand for from an economic competitive level. And what are ways we're going to mitigate that potential from happening? So that's the risk management approach we're taking. That's the strategic reason, there's a strategic underpinning to it. And I wanted to give that to you because I wanted to use that to pivot to why we're here talking about position and navigation timing. position navigation timing is one of those services, or one of those critical functions. Without question, a great majority of the infrastructure that we care about in terms of its ability to produce critical functions is dependent on precision, position, navigation, and timing services. We've looked at it. We've talked to our government and industry partners. We understand the degree to which PNT services are important to our ability to function as a nation. And so, recognizing that PNT is a critical function, understanding the strategic threat that we face from some of our adversaries, and looking at some of the threat reporting and other sorts of reporting, we quickly decided that this is one where we're going to maybe speed up the game in terms of making it a priority for the work we're doing at the National Risk Management Center as part of the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. And so even in advance of releasing the full set of full set of critical functions, we decided, hey, let's take the position navigation timing issue on head on right now. Let's do what we can, building off work that had already been done across DHS and the interagency, to elevate the importance of the security and resilience of position navigation timing services, and to make this an issue that we put dedicated resources, dedicated analysis, and dedicated public-private partnership against. And so we've been doing that over the last several months. We have, within DHS, established a position navigation timing program management office, which sits within the National Risk Management Center. I co-chair within DHS with my colleagues from DHS Policy, a department-wide executive committee that looks at the importance of PNT security and resilience to execute DHS missions and ways we can contribute to the overall Homeland Security space. And then, we staff the acting deputy secretary and her role in working across the interagency, particularly with the deputy secretary of the Department of Defense and the deputy secretary of the Department of Transportation on who provide leadership at the interagency level for PNT with that. So we rely on a governance structure that has become pretty well established to work PNT issues within DHS and the government, and you'll hear more about the PNT NCO and some of DHS efforts on the panel later on. And we are in position right now where we are developing a DHS strategy on things we can do to advance security and resilience as part of position navigation timing services. As part of that, our role within CISA will, of course, continue to be ensuring that PNT as a function that critical infrastructure is dependent on is secure and resilient. And we've already are in the process of taking a number of steps to do that. I thought I would talk a little bit about those steps, and then I think that drifts naturally into the events of the next couple of weeks in the GPS week rollover. So on one end, as you think about ensuring that the PNT system is secure and resilient, we have to keep a good eye on the threats that are out there. We are a source of intelligence collection requirements. We regularly review what adversaries may be interested in doing, and unfortunately, it is a true story that our PNT systems are things that we've seen enough reporting that there may be targets should things escalate geopolitically. But the assessments that we're really working on at CISA are the assessments on understanding how precise, how important the specific requirements, how important position navigation timing services are to critical infrastructure. And so when I talk about that, we have conducted a series of studies, some, drifting toward the deeply technical level, by which we look at, just how precise position needs to be for transportation. For transportation system to work on an automated basis. To what extent can you work, how long can you go if you lose precision? How much precision can you afford to go? At what point does the system really start to slow down? What's the exact requirement for precision across a range of transportation systems? Same sorts of questions if you think about precision agriculture. And then when you're talking about timing, to what microsecond and at what pace does the finance sector need to have exact exactitude around timing? How about the communication sector? How about to operate the electric grid? What happens if some of that is lost over some short period? How quickly does the system cascade toward real degradation? So we have done a series of analysis around that. The major reason we've done that sort of analysis is for the question of the cost-benefit question of something else we're looking at, which is what activities should the US government be taking to encourage, incentivize, invest in, build toward, mandate, I don't know what the right verb is, it depends as we continue to do the work, for a redundant P&T capability, and particularly for redundant timing capability. To what degree can we as a country continue to have, have to rely on the precision of the GPS system, and what are our backup sources for GPS or other global GNSS systems, and do we need more options in terms of terrestrial backups, localized backups? And so what we've taken our requirement studies in is an analysis of alternatives and a look at the marketplace of what's available out there to create redundancy in position, navigation, timing. Redundancy is a great risk management strategy. As much redundancy as possible creates something that looks a lot more like a layered defense strategy where there is no single point of ways that our adversaries can go after us. And so, we do think there's advancements that need to be made in terms of redundancy. I don't see that as some sort of nationwide terrestrial redundant system. I see it as taking advantage of the requirements of different industries, innovation, things that are already out there, things that are being fielded in different ways, technological advancement to allow for more sources of redundancy. And that's kind of where our research is trending at this point. In addition to that work we're doing at DHS, we've been in active conversations with NIST on the idea of a conformance framework for P&T receivers, particularly for timing receivers, as we're having this conversation. Can we build in, using processes that NIST is quite comfortable, developing standards and conformance so that critical infrastructure and owners, operators will have the tools out there to have more confidence in the marketplace of the receivers and other hardware that they're buying that enable P&T and increase the transparency in the system so you have confidence and guidance, and there's an expectation that the marketplace is competing with best in class, and it's easier for that to happen. And so I think we've been having very productive conversations with NIST about what a conformance framework would look like, and that's something that we hope to explore. And then we've also been doing other things that I think start to morph into particular preparation for the GPS week rollover. DHS, we like to talk about preparedness and resilience. We like to talk about information sharing. So we've expanded and made connections across several of the operations centers to get more reporting in, anything that's anomalous in terms of a GPS system and GPS behavior, so that we've got more situational awareness if anything starts to go wrong. That's going to be, those center relationships are going to be things we're exercising those in advance of the GPS week rollover. Just, hey, what would it look like if this is an event that's more than just a nuisance event? Are we prepared if we start to get these sorts of calls? How would we disseminate? How would things get up the chain to enable decision making? That's the kind of thing that we're doing for the GPS week rollover, but it's good practice in general, just to be out there looking for any anomalies so that we see them in advance. We've published several best practice guides on how to use P&T services, how to make sure that you understand your reliance on P&T services, report anomalies, best practices in fielding some of this capability, and we'll continue to do this sort of best practice work. And then we're still preaching the message of resilience, which you hear Secretary Nielsen talk about quite a bit, which is, part of resilience in this context is understanding how important it is having a backup plan and being prepared to operate as much as possible with a degraded level of capability, absorb, bounce back from things that might happen. And so, exercise what it means if you lose, as an organization, your ability to have precision in these for a little bit of time. Exercise, other sources. Exercise, how you can make sure that anything like that is localized. And so that's a whole range of things: sharing best practices, promoting preparedness, resilience, advancing standards and use of standards, studying risk mitigation alternatives that we're doing in general to enhance the security and resilience of PNT in the face of the strategic threat. And then because of that, and then the final element of that, of course, is doing that in partnership with industry. Industry is necessary to help us understand, what sort of standards would make sense, understand how systems work, actually do some testing of receivers working together, understand how anomalies may present themselves and how that may cascade across the system. That's the kind of information that you really can't do without real live conversation with operators, people who design the equipment, engineers, deployment. And so using the partnerships that we've been able to establish through the critical infrastructure structure, we've brought them into this conversation to make sure that any guidance, any best practices, any work we're doing to advance resilience is being done with the ultimate end goal in mind of something that's fielded more broadly than by the government, that makes sense from a business perspective for industry. So all that work then positions us well to get ready for the GPS week rollover. And let me stop there and say, when I say for us to get ready for the GPS week rollover, this is something that has been anticipated for a while. 1999 happened. We knew it was going to happen 19, 20 years later. For those people who designed receivers for timing systems that receive timing from GPS, the fact that a rollover was going to happen did not come out of the blue, and we'll talk about that in a little while. So when we're getting ready, it's just helping the operators who rely on precision timing, who think it's really important, really make the connections they need to make to have confidence that nothing's going to happen because of the GPS week rollover that's going to have any significant impact on their business, and take prudent steps to be prepared for that. This is, something that is not just happened in the last month or two. There's been a good amount of preparedness out there. But the reason I want to be here, the reason we want to be here a couple weeks out, is just hopefully keep that message going and remind anyone who still has lingering doubts of whether they should have confidence that their timing systems are going to be available, that there are some proactive, productive steps that they can still take. When we talk about that in the guidance we've issued, it's really understand your timing systems, understand how important timing is to the functions that your businesses rely on, to the functioning of your organizations. Understand and get to know the people who actually know your timing system. If you ask me, who at DHS right now was key to our ability to deliver precision timing, I'm not the CIO, so I don't need to know that, but the CIO better know that, and the CIO certainly does know that at this point. Then there's the second guidance about, inventory, the importance of timing, communicate with your manufacturers, and make that call, make sure that you get the confidence from the manufacturer that the receivers are built into to not go through any anomalies with the GPS week rollover. To the extent possible, or not to the extent possible, make sure you're doing the good sort of hygiene things that you should be doing all the time in terms of installing patches and updates, monitoring the firmware, making sure that there are not vulnerabilities that are introduced from a lack of maintenance. And then, do the extra work just in case something does go wrong or there's a hitch related to the rollover. Ensure that SOPs for managing disruption of time are up to date. Train operators on those SOPs. Go through an exercise. What happens if something goes wrong? To what extent are we prepared to deal with it? And be prepared to report any anomalies up and out so that you can be part of an overall solution if something happens that, again, it's not something that if you ask me to put on my prediction hat, I wouldn't be predicting widespread anomalies. I wouldn't be predicting that this is going to be a significant incident. But I'm a risk manager, I got to talk in terms of risk, and if there's a little bit of risk there that's introduced into the system, even if it's not a lot, it's prudent to take reasonable steps to monitor and manage that risk, reduce that risk if possible. In this case, these reasonable steps to take in advance of April 6th are the same reasonable steps that you probably should be doing from time to time if timing is really important to the operations of your business. So, if there's any one message, it's let's not get too concerned about what's going to happen in a couple weeks, but let's not downplay it in such that people don't take actions, because that action has benefit, whether it's for a GPS week rollover or for some other event down the road where timing is threatened or timing is degraded. And so that's what I hope to convey. From our perspective, it very much sits in our larger risk management perspective. This is a case where you take something that's a strategic threat, you see a moment where there's perhaps a little more risk than there usually is, not a lot more, a little more risk. It allows for some concerted activity, which will leave us better, and we'll have a better, secure, and resilient system that will make us more secure as a country. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And please. Great. Well, thank you for an excellent overview, not only in terms of the criticality of time to our as a critical function and critical service, but the GPS rollover itself. And I thought I'd start with a couple of very quick questions on the GPS rollover and then go a little more strategic. So for those of us who are old enough, everyone kind of remembers the Y2K hype and reality, both of which sort of came together. Do you see an analogy here to Y2K, how it's similar and also how it's different? And then with the view toward the future, are we going to be doing this again in 19 years or 20 years, or are we thinking about ways to ameliorate some of that?
Sure. I think the Y2K analogy is limited. It's not the worst analogy, but it's also not one that I would anchor on too much here. At the end of the day, I'm old enough to remember Y2K. There was a lot more uncertainty out there. There were a lot more players involved in terms of Y2K. Mm-hmm. Here, first of all, it's a relatively constrained set of ultimately pieces of hardware that we have to be concerned about. It's an event that has been, the risk was sort of designed in that this was going to happen over every period after 1,024 weeks. It was going to happen in there. It was planned for. It was judged a reasonable risk sort of in the design thing. It's not the case where, Y2K, where people couldn't imagine that they'd ever see the millennium. I mean, this is something, okay, we know 19 years from now this is going to happen. And the other thing, we've lived through this, and the receivers that have been fielded over the last 10, 15 years were fielded with this in mind. So I just don't see the level of uncertainty that something could go wrong that we all remember in Y2K in there. So if it causes people just to think about the importance of small things like this in design, fine as an analogy. But in terms of should we have a bunch of wake up the next day and is the world still
looking forward?
And looking forward, no. As I understand it, we're moving from 10 bits to a 13-bit set, and so we're talking about this will happen every 156 years. That's okay. At the current pace, and
you could buy down risk 100.
Yeah, there are other things 156 years from now that I'm more worried about than this one.
Yeah, no kidding. And in terms of criticality of both navigation, obviously positioning and precision and timing. I mean, when you think about it, timing is a absolutely essential and critical component of cybersecurity. And you can look at it through both lenses, but I mean, you've got trillions of dollars are traded daily.
Yes.
On world markets. Each one of those trades is time-stamped. What should we be thinking about there, especially in the context as you started your remarks? Some of these systems are susceptible to jamming, to spoofing. You mentioned 5 nation-state actors that are pretty aggressive in this sphere: Russia, China,
4.
North Korea, Iran.
I'm not going to make any news by adding this one to the list.
But what should we be thinking about in terms of moving forward, and what should industry be doing?
So the good news, I think, from sort of a banking perspective is there's enough sources to invest in resilience in timing. And there's enough incentives from a banking perspective that essentially is my conversations with the big banks and understand this is really important to them, and because this is really important to them, they put a lot of effort into understanding how they can design systems that will withstand things. And so, like we talk about with a lot of scenarios, the more complex you make the operations of something, the harder it is to cause the operations not to work. There's deterrence by design in some of that. And so, I think about, and this is part of why we're doing the kind of studies we're doing, where are there places where it's really important to be really precise, and then match that with what's the state of investment in precision, investment in belief that it's going to be precise in the face of types of things. And that's where we see gaps in that. That's the area where, I would be recommending additional risk mitigation, additional activity. But particularly with the banks, I mean, all the incentives in the world, and the money's there to make sure that they have redundant timing capabilities. That's largely from a trading perspective. I mean, it becomes, when you get to other commercial banks.
And that's just one sector. Obviously, all the grid and all the lifeline sectors, the most critical, and transportation, arguably the most significant in some of these areas. I'd be curious from a supply chain perspective. Do we have a Huawei issue here at some point, or are there concerns in terms of devices and at the hardware, firmware, software level we ought to be thinking about, or do we think that
I'm not going to call it a Huawei issue, either specific or not.
Just the 5G. It seems to have similar ramifications as the broader 5G discussion we're grappling with right now.
I think it's fair to say that anything that relies heavily on hardware and software to operate, there are potential supply chain issues, and there are supply chain risk management best practices, and there's understanding of that. So, I don't know that we have a unique supply chain issue in the delivery of P&T services right now, but as we've seen, you just mentioned the word cybersecurity, we've seen folks go away from direct cyber attacks as perhaps an attack vector to more supply chain attacks. I think we need to be ahead of that, doing supply chain best practices, know your vendors, know your second order vendors, build trust into build security into concern with the investment in suppliers, build trust into the system, get more information into that. Sort of similar things that we've talked in general with the work we've done at the National Risk Management Center at CISA on advancing supply chain risk management. Better information, better incentives to make investments. So, there's probably a way to go.
And one of the unique roles, I think, of the National Risk Management Center is not only to basically serve as the nation's risk manager on critical infrastructure-related issues and cyber-related issues, but also the way you do what you do, bringing the private sector in so they're not in receive mode alone. Government lead, private sector follow, it's both need to lead. And I think that is a unique element to how you do what it is you're doing. When you start looking at some of these functions that cut across various critical infrastructures, I mean, first three that come to mind to me are obviously industrial control systems, some of which are shared across critical infrastructures. Another would be what we're discussing today, timing, time. A third would be cloud and cloud-based services. Are there others, and how can we use the GPS rollover and the sweat equity that's been put into ensuring this for other critical functions? And I'm sure we're going to be identifying many more, but those three are the ones that come to the top of my mind.
Yeah, I mean, they're cross-cutting things, and we were talking earlier, the deployment of a 5G network that allows data at scale, automation at scale. I mean, those things are scale. I joke about scale. That's an overused phrase, right? It's already at scale, but just keep a magnitude improvement in some of this stuff. That's why we're doing the critical function work. Eventually, we want to sort of have the ability as much as possible, particularly the ones that we see a little more risk in, to break down what it is that enables the function to be delivered and see the commonalities across functions. And so when you say cloud computing, it's because more and more to enable the operations of these functions rely on cloud services to do that. And when you start to see cross-cutting things that are relied on across a number of different functions, you start to think, maybe I should spend more time talking to the providers of cloud services than the water utility if I want water, not a perfect connection with the cloud, but if I want to manage, I'll use the phrase at scale, but if we want to manage risk most effectively at the strategic level, maybe it's things that enable a bunch of things and have confidence there, because if you have confidence in the enabling functions, then you probably have a little more confidence that the business operation, and so that's kind of, it is a bit of an exploratory effort, but as you explore, some of these things are hiding right in front of you, and so it's not that hard to find, and so you begin to see cross-cutting trends, and when we see those cross-cutting trends, what it means sort of programmatically or operationally for the department and our partners is different set of people at the table, a different set of risk mitigation activities, policy levers than perhaps we've done traditionally through our critical infrastructure policy. And it's caused us to have to form new relationships and think about different markets than just the sector structure.
Two more very quick questions before we turn it over to our panel of subject matter experts. Standing where I sit, research priorities, are there any in this particular domain that you would like to see within the department, interagency, or industry?
So one of the things I didn't do a good job in my remarks, and I think the next panel will talk about, is the degree to which the Department of Defense, this is really important to the Department of Defense's national security mission, and obviously
Absolutely.
That doesn't surprise this audience, and the degree to which DoD, and so one of the things we want to do working with DoD as a partner is help translate some of what they're learning for the purposes, some of which we're not going to go translate to the market too quickly, but some of it can go into the market because they're out ahead in some of the investment they're making in terms of research for things that are important for their systems that absolutely have to function on that bad day. So I think one of the research priorities is just us tacking on with what DoD is doing and as appropriate, having some ability to help do what we can collectively to get that in the market. Secondly, I didn't talk about work we're doing, in terms of redundant systems, but once you get to sort of an analysis of alternatives, you may see that there are alternatives out there that aren't ready to be fielded, or we're already seeing there are alternatives out there that aren't ready to be fielded on a widespread basis, and so can we fund research that would take things further along the TRL level, or if TRL is the wrong word, further along the transition from innovation to use, the bridge around there. So I think that's another area of research that I'd like to see.
And I'd like to see DHS and CISA and your office weigh in on what that research agenda, because you speak for an important audience, the private sector here as well, and I just think putting your 5 cents into that discussion is actually really important.
Appreciate that.
And then finally, it seems like when you think about this issue from a cybersecurity issue, hygiene really is at the heart of all this, right? I mean, how many people don't patch, don't update? At the end of the day, yes, I am concerned about what a handful of very bad actors can do, because our dependency is so great that clearly the consequences of malfeasance there is so significant that, and it's been proven what countries can do and have been doing in that space. So we have to take that very seriously. But at the end of the day, it's the blocking and tackling, isn't it? It's like almost every other issue we're grappling with. We don't only have cyber ninjas over here. We've got the very basics that we need to continue to double down and make sure we're doing the fundamentals.
I mean, certainly when you're talking about an issue like the GPS week rollover, I think it's fair to say that hygiene gets you
pretty far, right?
Gets you to where you need to be in terms of the GPS week rollover. So far be it from me to say that hygiene is not a good risk mitigation strategy. In fact, it's a very good one, as you just suggested. But we want to be prepared for when hygiene's not enough.
Exactly. And that's where the department, I think, steps in a unique way. Bob, thank you. Thank you for your insightful comments. Thank you for your hard work and what you are leading to be able to drive some of these efforts. Without further ado, please join me in thanking Bob. And then I'm going to turn it over to Cheri and her panel of subject matter experts. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks very much, and thanks again, everybody, for being here today. I think one of the reasons why we did this event is just because time is such a critical underpinning for so much of everything we do in critical infrastructure and cybersecurity and other things. And in just talking to people like CIOs and CISOs, which are the folks that I talk to, so many of them said, time? What's that? How does that really affect my systems? How is it important to me? So awareness and understanding for hygiene purposes, as Frank just noted, and other things is really critical. So I applaud you all for being here today to talk about this. And we have an amazing panel today, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and what their relationship is with time in a minute. But first, let me introduce myself. As Frank indicated earlier, my name is Cheri Caddy, and I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security. And in the past, my role has been to work on cybersecurity issues, in particular with industry audiences. So public-private partnership, obviously we all know, those of us that work in the cyber world, that cyber is a team sport. And so much of what we do, it really requires that cooperation between the public sector and the private sector to get meaningful things done. And of course, PNT, time resilience, is just yet another one of those issues. That it's something that while the government works on a lot of the systems upon which we all rely, it's not just the systems like GPS that the government runs, but it's of course all of the receivers that are out there in critical infrastructure that everyone else is working on. So that partnership is really critical. It's one of the issues that I explore in the work that I do in government and on a regular basis. And so we've done a lot of work in this area in recent times to look at both cyber resilience, incentivizing, looking at how we can promote awareness and resilience of time. But then also going forward, how can we look at time as a really critical element of cybersecurity? The linkage between cyber and time is a great area for exploration. We're looking at how time is critical to, I think as some of the earlier remarks indicated, everything that you do in cyber, from timestamps on your forensics logs, timestamps on every data set that you might want to analyze. Time is a critical part of lots of different types of cryptography. If you lose access to precision time, things can not work, either unlock everything from a cryptographic standpoint or lock things forever. It's a factor of your system administrator rights. Most of those are time bounded now, so if things are reset to 0, you might not have access to some systems. So it's a really critical factor of cybersecurity, and we're definitely looking at exploring the intersection of these two ideas. And then also, in particular, I work a lot with the information technology sector, and as some of the previous conversation indicated, there are several sectors: financial services sector, the power sector, the communication sector, for which time is really a core part of their functions. And I know that they have lots of very smart folks working on those issues. But when we start to back out into the information technology sector, we have a whole lot of manufacturers of varying degrees and sizes that are building connected devices, our new Internet of Things. All of our connected devices, in some form or fashion, rely on time, whether it's our thermostats in our home or our potentially our self-driving cars, drones, and other things, all rely on PNT as a factor, and most of them aren't necessarily being built with time resilience in mind. So we have, a gap in knowledge there that we're trying to raise awareness of and talk to industry about how we can make sure that we're building all of these connected devices with resilient time in mind. So that's the issue set that we're looking to kind of explore more broadly. Today we're here to really talk about that awareness and getting to that business layer of folks that aren't necessarily always looking at time, but for whom it should be important. I would, before I turn it over to my panel to introduce themselves, I would also draw your attention to the fact that in the announcement for this particular event today, we did include a link to some of the time guidance that we've developed recently. It's on posted on DHS's website on US CERT and also on gps.gov, and I definitely encourage you to look at those awareness documents and help have that conversation back within the organizations that you represent. So that being said, let me turn it over to my very distinguished panel this morning, and I'd ask each of you to introduce yourselves and where you're from and what your interest is in time. Eric, please.
My name is Eric Reid. I am a senior systems and cyber engineer with Raytheon IIS in Aurora. My current job is GPS OCX, and for all the non-time folks, that's the next generation control system for the GPS satellite system. I was the timing infrastructure architect for OCX, and prior to that I worked Missile Defense National Team, C2BMC, and I did timing architecture on it also.
Great, thank you. Stormy.
Hi, good morning. Harold Stormy Martin. I'm the director of the National Coordination Office for Space-Based Positioning, Navigation, and Timing, which is a long way of saying we work GPS and related issues across the federal government. We support an executive committee that is co-chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Transportation, and then brings in departments and agencies from across federal government on those issues. And one of our primary interests is that today is T-minus 10 days to rollover. There's about, the estimates say, 600 million GPS receivers active in the U.S. right now, so helping the interagency get the word out on rollover, as we have been really for about the past year and a half with DHS and all the other partners that you'll see.
Okay, Charles.
Hi, Charles Palmer from IBM Research, and I'm more of a cybersecurity person, but ever since we started ethical hacking back in the 90s, messing with time has always been fun, and you could create spectacular results. Well, in later years, recently, I've been working with corporate and customers on various security problems, and one came up that got our attention, where a particular customer had something interesting happen, and they provided us with their logs, of course, and we looked at the logs, and the logs didn't make any sense because they didn't know what time it was. And specifically, they had pretty good time, they just didn't have pretty good notation of time zone. So you might say, well, that was just stupid. Well, yeah, it was, but at the same time, it started making us ask questions. How many of our customers really need to know what time it is, and consistently, and to know when it's not right? And then we started looking around inside IBM. Do we know? And we mercifully found out we do. But what was surprising, and what has gotten me into this, is the fact that so many of our customers have just assumed it's a utility that's always going to be there and it's always right. And it's become a vast education for both some people inside IBM, but a whole lot of our customers in fields like financial services, where you think they would already know, but some do, some don't. So it's been fascinating.
Okay, Dan?
Yeah, my name is David Beverly. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering at Auburn University. I've been there 18 years. When I got there, I founded and direct the GPS and Vehicle Dynamics Lab, or we call it the GAV Lab, where we focus on navigation, assured PNT, and also vehicle automation and autonomous systems. And so, of course, PNT is important to all those things. And so our group basically has been researching things around PNT and autonomous vehicles and autonomous systems for the past 18 years.
Sarah.
Hi. Hi, good morning. I'm Sarah Ellis-Peed. I'm with DHS CISA National Risk Management Center. So you just heard for about 45 minutes from my boss, Bob Kolasky, about our interest in time. So I won't repeat that for you. I did want to just foot stomp a couple of things. One, so the April 6th date that we've been talking about, I want to make sure we're not overly anchoring on that, depending on how some of the receivers implement the different broadcast signals that they're receiving. It may actually transition on a different date, so just a foot stomp, it's very important to know your receiver, know when that rollover date is for you. I think that's an important one. And then also just to reemphasize again, the importance of knowing your system, knowing where your time is, knowing your manufacturers. We've done, and in the course of our efforts to understand and make PNT more resilient, some different inventories, largely within the federal government, about what folks are using time for, what receivers are doing, et cetera. When you ask someone, where do you get your time from? Where is your receiver? What is it doing? You mostly get a blank look at you. And only recently, I think, have folks like this panel come to understand the importance of it. Certainly in the military, that's been an understanding for a long time. And there are exceptions in aviation and other places, but in a large part, a lot of folks do not understand their dependency on time, and that's something that I think today we're really trying to promote and just start asking the questions so that as we walk out, we all walk away a little bit more educated.
Thank you, thank you. And again, I'll foot stomp the guidance documents that we had linked to this announcement were designed to do just that, start that question asking for both, we have two versions, one for the C-suite and one for senior technical decision makers to just sort of inquire. One would hope that within your organization somebody knows something about time, but it's always good to ask questions, so we've definitely given you some help in that regard. So, and Sarah, thanks. That was a great lead into what the first question I wanted to pose, and teeing off of the previous discussion. Stormy, can you tell us, as the head of GPS, a little bit more about the rollover? What specifically is going to happen? What steps have you taken? Anything that you think is good awareness for the public?
Sure, thank you, Cheri. Appreciate that. I think one thing, first off, is to piggyback on the great remarks that Bob Kolasky had in terms of government-industry partnership. GPS, I think, is one of the poster children for that kind of partnership, a poster child for the scientific and economic power of an unregulated good technology. We, the federal government, do not tell industry you have to use GPS. We don't mandate that we build your receivers. Anyone who wants to go build a GPS receiver can build a GPS receiver. What we do as the federal government is we publish a list of recommendations, which we call an interface spec, and ISGPS 200H is online now if you want to go look at it at gps.gov. And it has a whole bunch of recommendations. If you're going to build a receiver, we suggest you look for these things. And it explains a lot about how the GPS signal operates. One of those things that is common whether you're using GPS for location-based services. Maybe you're a company that does ads when people are going hither and yon, or maps, or maybe you're a timing user. No matter what, you get a data feed from those GPS satellites. One part of that data field is a piece that's basically a counter of weeks. It says how many weeks in this GPS epoch. GPS time began back around 1980. There was one previous rollover in 1999, and there were some receivers that had problems. As Sarah mentioned, the rollover that your receiver will see although it's going to see that transition on 6 April, some of the receiver manufacturers took the experience from 1999 and wrote their software and firmware so that their rollover effect would happen on a date that they had more control over. So we have already started to see some receivers back as early as 2014 that had some problems with date and time. I think the first thing that we need to say about this is that the federal government thinks that all receivers that are designed in accordance with that interface specification should operate fine through the rollover, because as Bob Kolasky mentioned, it's something that's been planned for. It's designed in. We know it's going to happen. The interface spec tells the manufacturers this is what's going to happen, and how to take that into account. So why should we be worried about it at all? Well, part of this is the old campfire story, right? We're sitting around a campfire and I tell somebody a story. Well, by the time it gets around to the other side, it's changed slightly. So we're not 100% sure that all of the industry GPS receiver manufacturers, and there are thousands of different makes, models, and firmwares of GPS receivers out there, we're not sure that they heard exactly what we intended when they read that interface specification. So I think the great thing is that the DHS best practices that have been out there for a while, these wonderful slick sheets that DHS and the ESF folks have put together, is that it says, hey, contact your vendor and ask them, how does the receiver you sold me, how is that going to operate through this event? So I think that's an important way to look at it, and kind of, again, puts it in perspective. We think receivers that are designed well in accordance with that interface spec will be okay, but we know that we've already seen a few that had some issues.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. That's a great point. And I don't know, Sarah, if you had anything else that DHS is recommending that organizations do to prepare?
It really is primarily the basics of what we've talked about in terms of having good hygiene, putting your patches in on your firmware software, knowing who your manufacturer is, and having those basic discussions. So I don't think there's a lot to add there. Bob talked earlier about understanding if something happens, what do you do? We do hear anecdotal stories about an alarm going off on a GPS receiver, and the person sitting next to it has never encountered this alarm before. They don't know what to do. We heard a story the other day, such an alarm went off. The person said, well, this is an electronic. What do you do in that situation? You kind of knock it a little bit and you reboot it. Well, that turned out to be the absolute worst thing to do. Though it had alarmed, it was still providing time into the system, and when the individual rebooted it, it caused a major problem in the system. So you just need to train your folks what to do when they hear an alarm so that they can respond appropriately and you can get back on track.
Okay, I think that's great advice, and I think too, just adding on to the anecdotes, one of those things, because time is such a widespread factor underpinning so many different functions, even just within a single organization, it's one of those things that everybody and nobody is responsible for. So even just figuring out within your organization who has the accountable finger on this is probably a great step to take as well. So not that we're expecting this, but if you have a time failure as an organization, what's the best way to reconstitute time? And I'll ask some of my more academic friends, Dr. Beverly, how would you reconstitute time?
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure I understand that question.
So if your organization loses access to time, how do you get good time back? You're next.
Yeah. I guess like that's been said earlier, the hope is, so we've been testing some of the receivers to see what they're going to do kind of over the rollover event. And our hope basically is that the organizations, have the patches in place that are they're gonna account for the rollover. So when the receiver basically, or when GPS, outputs that it's week 0, they're going to account for that time.
Okay. Eric?
What I would say also is, if you happen to be using GPS as your principal source of time, and you end up with a denial of service from jamming or just poor signal for whatever reason. Everyone in the organization has a wristwatch, has a phone. If you put a time that is close in your master time sources, let them synchronize, and then restrict who can talk to them, so you're not putting time that isn't very accurate out to your enterprise, but allow them to go to a different portion of your enterprise that has valid time and sync those up. You can reconstitute those time sources during that period when you don't have GPS, during that period, and get your masters up. Once you have your masters up, start bringing in the rest of your enterprise. And that, to me, is probably the best and fastest way to reconstitute your enterprise. And NTP servers synced to GPS are in nanoseconds. Computers don't need nanosecond accuracy. They need, at most, microsecond accuracy, but most function quite well with millisecond accuracy. And by syncing NTP servers across your enterprise, you can easily achieve a few milliseconds of accuracy within your enterprise.
Okay, great. So beyond the GPS rollover, which we've definitely talked about, there are other concerns that can happen with regard to time. There are known time events that are predicted and announced well in advance. Things like leap seconds that happen every couple of years to adjust, daylight savings time, and anecdotally we know that when those time events happen, we see spikes in calls to the help desk. Things happen even though they're known well in advance. Are there other kinds of problems that happen with regard to time? And I think you alluded to them, spoofing and jamming. How big of a problem is that? And maybe I'll start with you again, Stormy. How reliable is GPS? How resilient to spoofing and jamming and those kinds of issues?
Sure. Yeah. I think when you look at the system overall, of all the time and navigation systems out there, especially the navigation satellite systems, there's only one that's operated with the full faith and trust of the U.S. government, and that's GPS. The U.S. Air Force operates GPS, does a great job. They have put an enormous amount of money into harden the satellites from a full spectrum range of threats, okay, and including cybersecurity. Likewise, they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars upgrading their ground command and control system to be cyber resilient. And as Eric was talking about, there's a new command and control system in development that they've literally spent billions of dollars to design cybersecurity in from the ground up. So that leaves the one little piece that doesn't talk about is really your receivers. And again, you buy your receivers based on your own economic analysis and your own engineering analysis, and you go buy from a vendor that you trust, and you operate that receiver. And by and large, industry loves their GPS receivers, right? They're reliable, they're accurate. Why does industry buy them in the first place? They add to the bottom line. So they use them every day, and it's important to remember that's the piece that owners and operators have the biggest control over, is what's the cyber resilience, for instance, in your receiver. Well, it turns out that most receivers are designed like 1970s radios. They really don't have cyber resilience designed in. And just like in the evolution of computers, we went through the stage where we were all on the internet and it was truth and roses and unicorns, and then we found out, you know, you can get hacked, you can get viruses. So instead of unplugging all your computers, what people did is they said, okay, I'll spend a little money, I'll buy some firewalls, I'll spend a little money, I'll buy some virus protection, I'll spend a little time and update when new patches come out. Well, those are the same kinds of things that the DHS best practices and the new interface specification talk about receiver manufacturers doing for GPS. Let's spend a little time and money and build competent GPS receivers that do the normal kinds of 21st century cyber hygiene. So if, as we move towards that, you're going to see a real increase in the ability of your receivers to resist a whole host of things. And you know, as we look at this historically, how many times have there been major interruptions in GPS? There have not been a lot. Although it is although your receivers in particular are susceptible to jamming and spoofing because the signal's very weak, it hasn't happened a lot in the past, but it's growing. You can read the news as well as we can, and you see lots of things going on out there. So the time is right for investment to protect your GPS so that you continue to get that great value from it.
And are the newer receivers that are on the market now, they're more resilient to spoofing and jam?
They're starting to, what's really, I think, required out there is some of that market pull, right? The manufacturers want to know that there's a market that resilience is important to, right? And as that becomes more important, and this GPS rollover is a great means of kind of kicking off that discussion as you become more aware of what time resilience, what cyber resilience your systems have, that's going to pull on those receiver manufacturers. If you're a CIO, if you're part of your cybersecurity system in your organization, be a smart buyer. Next time you go to buy a device, tell, you know, in your requirements, your contracts, whatever, tell them, hey, the new receivers have to meet the best practices that are in the DHS document. They have to meet the valid data checking in the interface specification. All of these things are publicly available online. And with that kind of power of the purse string, you're going to incentivize your manufacturers to give you the cyber resilience that you deem adequate for your organization.
Great.
To answer a little bit of that end of that question, there are receivers now that you can purchase so manufacturers are coming out with receivers on the commercial market that do offer jamming detection and spoofing detection. So the receivers can tell you they're being jammed or spoofed, but then it's still a denial, and so you basically are not going to have that P&T service. You at least get some information. They're not foolproof, but you at least get some information that the signal is not available, but now you don't have a signal.
And as I think Stormy pointed out earlier, it's important that there's no government regulation that says manufacturers have to adhere to a government standard or specification. So that demand signal from customers is really, really important, and understanding the importance of resilient time to your critical functions of your organization is important as well.
Can I say something?
Sure.
And one thing to note, that localized jammers for GPS can be looked up on the internet. There was an individual who worked for a company. They put GPS trackers in their vehicles, and several times he drove by airports and took down the airports because he blocked the GPS signals in and around the airports. So just because it's not a wide area denial doesn't mean for a few dollars you can get a localized jammer. Now, the individual went to jail for it. However, it did cause quite a disruption, and there was very little you could do to prevent that disruption without having robust enough infrastructure for the carryover.
And you raised, that's a great point. We know that one of the things that's concerning is the increasingly widespread availability online, of course everything's available online, of relatively inexpensive jammers and spoofers, and even though they don't have a broad area of impact, if you position them in the right place, as in next to an airport, you can certainly create quite an effect. So there's definitely areas of worry out there. Coming back to one of my earlier questions, how do private organizations, and maybe I'll ask you, Charles, how does IBM deal with a leap second? Do you have an approach for that?
Yes. First, I had my finger up.
Oh, sorry.
Regarding the previous conversation, this sounds so much like the early days of cybersecurity. When I would go talk to customers, and we would do an ethical hack or whatever, we would talk to them, and we would find problems, and they would say, well, why would anybody do that? Okay. Why would anybody jam GPS? Why would anybody spoof GPS? And it's come full circle. I'm getting that question now. When we tell them time is kind of a thing, they say, well, who cares? And there's a lot of education. What we're doing today is education. What I'm doing weekly, if not more than once a week at IBM, is talking to customers and saying, you should think about this. How does IBM do it? Well, one of the things we found is, like I mentioned earlier, we were astonished to find that we were actually internally doing a pretty good job for time. There was a problem I think a lot of people have where you've installed whatever system, whether it's a Mac, Windows, or Linux, and it comes with time server turned on. And okay, well, maybe that's a good thing for the community. Only if you've got the time set correctly. And so we've found lots of systems inside IBM and inside customers everywhere we look, where there's all these servers, time servers turned on that could be serving flaky time. And that's just a matter of hygiene. Turn them off unless you're going to set them appropriately. As far as leap second, I didn't know how IBM recommended doing that. And as it turns out, the systems at IBM, you have a choice. You can either just ignore it. That's not a good idea. You can smear it, or you can do what some of the IBM systems do, which is they just stop for 1 second. You can't count past 60. Software breaks. If you have a second number 60s, a lot of software just says, "Whoa, there's something insane here." So they just stop, and then start again. And I was incredulous, because how can you do that? And they said, well, the time is never wrong. The applications never know. And you're fully within all regulations required by financial services, so what's the big deal? And it's been working like that for as long as we've had leap seconds. It's working very well. So,
do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah.
Raytheon? How does Raytheon handle leap seconds?
Well, and leap seconds, especially when we're talking satellite control, comes into play. And what we have done is we have abstracted the satellite control software layer from the operating system layer. So since no two operating systems behave the same with the leap second, we've abstracted that layer and we handle it in software, so we have repeatable behavior among all of our systems, as opposed to having each system jump. Just to let people know, basically, Windows repeats a second. Linux does a smear where it slows the clock down by half. Some Unix systems repeat seconds, others smear, others just jam. So in order to have predictable behavior, we've actually abstracted the software to do that behavior. But that means you actually have to go in and configure those software applications in advance of the leap second.
Sounds like hygiene.
It is. And I will bring up one other thing. For everyone using iRig-based time, if they are not using IEEE 1344 extensions on the iRig, and they are following the disastigs and doing pushed NTP pulled NTP as opposed to pushed NTP, your systems can jump anytime within 24 hours of that leap second. So your whole enterprise may jump willy-nilly during that day. So that is a big takeaway for anyone with the leap second.
So maybe a best practice would be to pull time rather than have it pushed, or
no,
is that
because
what you're saying?
that's a disastig that says you're not supposed to. No, what you have to do is when you choose your NTP masters, they have to be able to have an a priori knowledge of the leap second event, so they can properly broadcast the leap second event.
So planning and predictability is the best practice.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So we've talked a lot about resilience and the need for resilience and the need for best practices. I'm interested in getting some perspectives on what does good time resilience look like for an organization? What are the sort of the key tips that you have for maybe technology leaders and or business leaders, the C-suite? How can at the strategic level leaders make sure that they're doing good time resilience? Maybe I'll tap you, Charles.
Well, the first thing is, do you know what time it is? Who knows what time it is? When we talk to customers, some of them, depending on industry, they've got a complete infrastructure and they've got guys and gals who know this stuff. They get right here, we get it from here, we coordinate with that. But that's very industry centric. Infrastructure protection, perhaps, in financial services, they got it. Stock trades, that stuff, yes. Lots of other customers, they just sort of look around and say, well, I think Jack does it, and Jack's watch. And if we're lucky, and Jack has a smartwatch hooked to his phone, which is synced to time.apple.com or Windows. Maybe, as my colleague said, it's okay, it's close enough. But so many of our customers just sort of plug it in and assume that time is set. So the first question I ask the C-suite people is, whose job is it? Who's doing this? Who, if you needed to know, who would you ask? And then I go ask that person and ask the same question, and it's amazing how far I go before I find someone who actually can say, oh, well, we do this. And as far as multinational or highly distributed systems, that can get exciting as well. They think they're using NTP or PTP, but they don't know until you get down to that one person who does. And they're usually very glad to hear you because they've been ignored for so long. They're glad to have the attention. So the main question is, how do you know what time it is? How do you keep track of it? And the one question no one's been able to answer really is, how do you know if it's wrong? And a few folks have some ideas, but there's really not a lot of good detection out there outside of the planned events, the leap second, the 19th I mean, the 19-year thing and others.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So do you have a single accountable person at Raytheon for time?
We have an IPT, and within OCX there's a group of people in there. Mm-hmm. Generally within Raytheon we have our network infrastructure folks that are responsible for time. We've tasked time to the network infrastructure individuals.
Okay. And is it also, a good best practice to have redundant sources of time so that you're checking against to make sure you have the right time?
Yes, and my recommendation is a lot of organizations say I only need 2. My recommendation would be you need 3. Reason being is if I have a discrepancy, which one's right? Mm-hmm. If I have 3, I have a better guess at what's right and what's wrong.
Okay.
And I can repair the one that isn't right and still have stable time during that period, but at least 3.
Okay. Any other thoughts on what a good time resilience looks like for an organization? We've got accountability. We've got.
What we also use is to show them where time inaccuracies or inconsistencies can bite them. And back to my first example of security logs, transaction logs, whatever. If the times aren't close, depending on what it was, you may not be able to find the path of the ransomware through your company or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I think those are all good practices. I think I'd like to pick up on one of the questions that Frank asked earlier, which I really liked, which is the intersection of supply chain issues and time. And we know GPS is the U.S. government standard fielded by the U.S., but there are other constellations out there, and there are other countries that operate constellations, and a lot of the hardware available now taps into multiple GNSS systems. Do you think, and let me ask Stormy, do you think that we have a supply chain issue related to time and GPS versus other systems?
Well, I think for any system that you're operating, your company, if you're a business or if you're a government organization or what, to piggyback on what Sarah was saying, you need to understand what your time needs are, right? Most, if you take 10 different companies, their needs for time tend to be different. They tend to be very particular. So first step is you really need to understand what your need for time is. How accurate do you need? Do you need 30 nanoseconds or is 3,000 nanoseconds, right? 3 microseconds, is that good enough? And then that can really get you into the scope of understanding then what are the supply chain effects that you have. For most of the let's take the cell phone example. For most of the cell phones that are manufactured in the past, 5+ years, the chips in them get GPS, they get the Russian system GLONASS, the Chinese system Beidou, and the European system Galileo. And the U.S. government has worked with international providers of GNSS for years to try and help everyone behave in a way that is cooperative. We call it interoperability and compatibility, transparency. Right, we work with the foreign governments to say if you're going to provide a navigation signal, also provide some sort of interface specification or ICD so that manufacturers know how to design things well. So for any of your critical applications, I think you do need to take a look at, what are your sources, and then make that that decision on, risk management. What amount of trust do you put in each of those systems? Because I think, I think there is a difference. I think certainly, our policy for 14 years has been that the U.S. needs to maintain leadership in GNSS, and we have tried to do that. GPS has been continuously improved. One of the things to look at, too, when you look at not only supply chain effects, is what do you do as you move into the future? Certainly, GPS is, I think, very well positioned for that. We are talking a lot today on the rollover about something that receivers see on one particular signal coming down from GPS satellites. Well, what a lot of folks may not know is that there are multiple civil signals coming down from GPS today, and some of the more modernized signals, the L2C and the L5, they have a different navigation message than the legacy navigation message, which uses that 10-bit thing. Its counter is 13 bits, so as Bob Kolasky was talking about, that rollover would occur in like 2137. The question is, A, do your receivers really use that? Do your systems and software pull that information in? And as the ground system that GPS uses matures, when OCX comes online in about the 2022 timeframe, then the monitoring network will get set up to monitor those second and third civil signals. So there is a lot of room for growth for the future using those modernized signals that helps alleviate some of the time issues and the rollover issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As a globally distributed organization, does Raytheon interact with the multiple GNSS signals? And
we do not.
Okay.
And one of the reasons we don't is there are, especially the sections that deal predominantly with the U.S. military and government, mm-hmm. And the reason we don't is there are guidance documents from the government that define what warfighter systems may and may not do, and what they must do from how they operate.
Okay.
So we tend to choose and follow those guidance documents as closely as possible.
Okay. Charles, you have an IBM perspective as a globally distributed entity?
Well, as I discovered when we started asking, it's all sort of coordinated. There's a central group that has the job to provide good time, and they have 30-something servers around the galaxy that people use, and the only thing is that even inside a large corporation, whether it's IBM or a big bank or whatever, getting the word out that being able to track your time back to UTC or whatever may be a regulatory requirement that amazingly some regulated customers don't even realize. And it might just be good housekeeping, just a good thing to do. So that's how we do it, is we have a group that's what they do. It's not a big group, and it's not even that hard, really. They do other stuff as well.
Okay. Okay.
One of the things I'll point out on the GNSS side, it's a little bit tricky because two of the constellations that were mentioned, of course, are coming from two of the countries that were mentioned earlier. So if you've got critical timing needs, how much do you want to rely on those systems? But at the same time, the diversity does provide some resiliency. So they're at slightly different frequencies. So in terms of jamming, also additional constellations. So if you're in environments maybe where you've got satellites coming in and out of view, the additional constellations, the additional frequencies, and also the ability to check, as was mentioned earlier, you want three sources of time, the ability to check against the three. So there are some advantages, but it is a little bit tricky. Plus, The other constellations don't utilize the same time standards, so you have to make sure that you're handling the time offsets between the different constellations, which the manufacturers that are doing GNSS receivers are doing, but it's something to be aware of as well.
Okay, good point, good point. In thinking back towards, one of the discussions we started on earlier, as I mentioned at the outset, I think one of the increasing areas of concern is that we're building so many more things that require time in our Internet of Things connected world, in our cloud virtual environments. Time is such an increasingly important factor for these things that are connected. How do we incentivize manufacturers of those things to consider time resilience when they're building those products, building them in, and building in resilience in terms of the means for those kinds of connected devices to fail in a predictable way, to have a known holdover. That is that, if that device loses connectivity to GPS or a time source, that it continues to function within specifications, that it fails in a predictable way. How do we, any suggestions for how we can incentivize manufacturers to start thinking about building in time resilience?
I'll comment on that a little bit. I think it's kind of some of what we talked about earlier is there needs to be a market pull for this. Folks that need reliable, precise time have to be in touch with their manufacturers, have to be talking about the community, have to be voicing their needs. It's part of, again, why we're here today. I think if everybody called on the week number rollover and said, I have a concern, what are you doing about it? That would send a substantial message that people cared and people listened, and they need to start thinking about things. So I do think the market pull is extremely important. I also think, we can't undersell the desire by manufacturers to do the right thing. We've been talking with manufacturers on and off for the last couple of years about themselves, encouraging their engineers and their workforce to be thinking about resilience, and a lot of them are receptive. They want to do the right thing. They also, it's interesting as you get into startup communities, people who just are, wanting to get into the marketplace, building IoTs, et cetera. It's not that they don't want to do the right thing. It's that they often don't know. They don't know that time is an important thing, and so I do think just again education is key here.
Mm-hmm. Charles, in the course of talking to IBM customers, do you feel like you've created some demand signals through awareness?
I certainly hope so. It comes. It's a parallel with security. Is how much do you need? Does your Fitbit really have to have nanosecond? Probably not. Does your refrigerator? Maybe not. Does your car? Well, it depends. And just as she said, just getting them to think about it as another parameter that they're trying to optimize. That's the first step. We found with security, when they started getting religion about security, that there were no products to be had. They started asking, and that's the pull that we're looking for. So first step is just to get their attention and raise awareness, and then the pull should happen.
Okay. Yeah, Eric?
And I would add to that, don't just think about time, but position.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring up position is if you think of the GPS in your car and you drive through a tunnel, your GPS will no longer be connected to the satellite constellation, but the accelerometers built into the unit will continue to breadcrumb your position. So it is extrapolating your position even though it does not have connectivity to the satellite. So in certain applications, it goes beyond time to the position for the navigation piece.
But in your example, you can build resilience in.
Absolutely.
So that it continues to function as what intended, even though that connection has been lost.
Absolutely.
So it's a great example. Okay. Yeah.
The one takeaway from that is if it doesn't know where it is to start, it won't know how to get beyond that. So that is the one takeaway. It's that whole same thing. How do I regenerate time? You have the same, how do I regenerate position?
Yeah, good point, excellent point. Okay, so then thinking about that's a great segue into sort of what's our look for the future, and we've talked a little bit about it, but I want to get all of your thoughts. So the future, Stormy, I think you've talked a little bit about the future of GPS moving to the 13-bit. We're not intending to have the same 19-year rollover cycle. Any other things that you can talk about from the future perspective?
Sure, and I think the piece to focus on here really is, you know, the future of receivers. I think we're about to enter another golden age of receivers where you're going to see more and more receivers, which is saying a lot, right? I already said the estimates are there are about 600 million GPS receivers in the U.S. right now. Predictions are next year worldwide we'll get to the point where there will be more GPS receivers than there will be people on the planet. And I think that number is really going to take off. When you think about automated vehicles, from the little drones, you know, your kids fly, to ones that may be delivering packages, to you know, automated shuttles and taxi cabs and things like this, plus the Internet of Things. Again, and there we go to the broader PNT issue, right? Because a lot of things, they may need to know their position, or they may need to know their time, or both. And in a lot of those cases, GPS receivers, right, which are by and large chip size now and very, very cheap, are great means of getting that kind of information. So I see a real spike in the receiver populace. As we go through that spike, it becomes even more important that we take that next step to start injecting cyber resilience into those systems. Let's take the automated vehicle industry, for example. I don't think I'm aware of any automated vehicle manufacturer that plans to use GPS only as its means of navigation. They're going to have LiDAR, they're going to have all sorts of other sensors. But from a cybersecurity standpoint, what we say to the CIOs out there is, if your cybersecurity plan does not also cover your GPS-enabled devices from a radio frequency perspective, then your cybersecurity plan has some holes. And we need to move into that generation where GPS is just another piece of the big super network, and you protect the whole network, or you're really not protecting any of the network.
Mm-hmm. That's a great perspective. Charles, that sounds like a whole lot of data. Is Watson going to help us in the future with some AI solutions?
Well, it always goes back to it's all about the data, right? Yeah, we're already seeing some customers saying, look, we drank it, we understood, and we're collecting all this information. Where are we going to put it? And more importantly, what can we do with it? Mm-hmm. And that's another selling point is, okay, if you actually have accurate time, it's easier to make these, collapse the data into clumps and see what's going on in your business and do some data science, figure out what's happening. And if you have the data, you can use it, but otherwise, and as I said, back to the security thing, if you have the data and it's, it's out of sync, then, well, pitch it.
Yeah, I always like to remind my data analysts that all data has timestamps, and if your timestamps are messed up, no analytics. So, critical point going forward. Dr. Beverly, what do you see in the future of research in this area?
There's a couple of things. I mean, also, so we mentioned the increase in the word size for the weak rollover on GPS, but also new GPS signals basically are going to have higher power, so there'll be a little more resistance to anti-jamming or to jamming. There's also a lot of research being done in alternative sources of PNT and backup systems that could be used for short durations, either to detect or authenticate any anomalies within timing or position. that can be used as a backup until that comes back. So there's research being done and better, so accelerometers was mentioned earlier, better IMUs, better clocks that can be used. And, you know, again, we mentioned earlier the receivers now are putting in these integrity checks to be able to determine whether or not they're being spoofed, whether or not they're being jammed. And then that would allow some of these other backup systems to be investigated. And the U.S. government's also looking at other backup sources, everything from ELRAN to other position and timing sources.
Okay. Any perspective from Raytheon on the future?
Not that I can really talk about.
Oh, that's fine. That's a fine answer, and we know, and I'll hit Sarah last. You know that DHS is in the process of doing, as Bob alluded to, lots of assessment of time dependency for critical infrastructure. And he alluded to, I think, DHS is planning to put out a time resilience plan. Is that something?
Well, we have a strategic plan in the works we're hoping will be issued shortly by the Secretary, which speaks both to position, navigation, and timing. So we hope that will come out. I think maybe he was referencing more directly the backup requirements study that we've been doing for a couple of years, where we've gone out and met with each of the 16 sectors to understand what is your true precision requirement for timing. How long can you actually operate without timing being in place? And we actually set out to look at position, navigation, and timing has by far become apparent that in our modern technology, that's the most important aspect of the PNT systems. So that will be coming out. But in terms of, you know, your broader question about, you know, what's the future of resilience look like? What does it look like in the critical infrastructure space? You know, I think the key thing here is that we need to stop thinking about the signal coming in as sort of an unadulterated, you know, truth. It's coming into a system, and that system needs to be smart enough to recognize when there's an anomaly, so that it doesn't just bounce back 19 years, but that it knows there's something unusual here. It's impossible for it to be, you know, this other time, and that the system can be smart enough to understand that there's something happening in the time. Especially as we have multiple time signals coming in, we're going to need to be able to integrate that, and that is not a capacity that is built into many systems right now. And just, you know, generally, I think this fits into, you know, the large message that we try to promote within critical infrastructure, and you know, we have talked a little bit about resilience by design, is that as we're building these systems, we're often very short-sighted. We need to be thinking, we need to sort of take off our rose-colored glasses and know that at some point, you know, time is going to be disrupted, you know, cyber attacks of various types are going to happen, and we need to build systems that fail gracefully, that let us know when they're failing, that there's some strong audit capability in there. And so we need to just here and in all other aspects, as we're increasing our reliance on technology, build in some of those core resilient features.
Excellent, well said. Okay, I think with that, I'd like to open up. I think we have a few minutes if there are any questions from the audience. There's been a lot of different things and topics covered, so please.
Questions for
tell us who you are, please.
Rich Cooper with the Space Foundation, formerly of DHS a number of years ago. Questions for your DHS colleague. You talked about some of the incentives and things that need to be done there. Is CISA or anybody at DHS looking at the use of the Safety Act to try to incentivize industry on some of these fronts? It does have a research, development, testing, and evaluation designation that could prompt people to come in to bring forward products to assist with these types of things. Is the Safety Act anywhere within the decision tree or consideration there?
So I'm not a Safety Act expert, so I'll tell you what I know, and then I can take it back and find a more fulsome answer myself. So Safety Act sits within S&T rather than CISA, so I wouldn't say that there's a strong interconnection naturally happening there. My understanding of the Safety Act also is that it's voluntary, is that folks seeking Safety Act designation have to come in. You're looking for the mic, so maybe there's another aspect there.
The companies who submit the Safety Act bring forward their information to have it reviewed by the department. Also has some third-party validation, and it provides that limited liability protection for companies to bring forward anti-terrorism types of technologies and get them into the market.
Yeah, I think that's certainly an option. I don't think we can require receivers, manufacturers to do that. Should they do so, we would certainly follow all of those testing protocols.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah,
yes, sir.
hi, John Mills. Hi, Cheri. Formerly with DOD, retired, and now with Aerospace Corporation. So I started to hear about, thank you. So I started to hear about some of the topics of resilience, and there are good discussions here, and that's, so I didn't hear anything about, there used to be a system called INS, which really was the thing before we really got into the GPS world. But I was thinking about, as we expand our resilience horizon, we start to go back to the future and start to think about some of those older things. And also maybe the requirement for these to migrate into standards, the ability to toggle through, mandated in standards, the ability to toggle between different sources here. So that was kind of my second comment. And then my third comment, an interesting analogy, is in Afghanistan, how, I think this is kind of a good analogy, is how the cell phone networks were kind of off limits by all parties here. Kind of classic military operations, you take out the cell phone towers here, but in Afghanistan, because everybody depended on them, all parties depended on them. So it was an interesting, it kind of was a generally agreed upon off limits activity to mess with the cell phone towers. So three essential distinct comments there.
So I'll have to rely on my panelists for the historical perspective. Please help me.
Yeah, I think you bring up really good information. One of the things that I've seen, not only in the U.S. but internationally, in terms of the automated vehicle and connected vehicle industry, is that they plan to use and are using in testing now all those kinds of sources. INSs of various shapes and size, LiDAR systems, all sorts, a suite of sensors that also then includes GNSS that they pull in to get their information. For some of the cases that they want to be able to operate automated vehicles, imagine you're driving on 95 in rush hour traffic. Standard GPS and standard signals from most of the satellites don't really keep you close enough to avoid bumping into the guy next to you. So they plan on using inertial systems and LiDAR systems and all sorts of things like that to use different pieces and parts as needed to get the navigation solution that they need. And you talked a little bit about standards as well. I know, DHS and several of the departments and agencies have been working with NIST to get a dialogue going on potential voluntary cyber resilience standards for GNSS receivers and other sorts of things, and standards for resilient timing. So I think that discussion is going, and I would encourage everyone to be a part of that. Because I think long term, it's those kinds of voluntary standards which cause an industry to really make a change, and it's a great thing, and it's very doable. It's not the fastest process in the world, but this kind of evolutionary growth of your timing and navigation systems is not a really quick thing anyway. So they marry up, I think, very well. And then one last point, really hearkening back to some of our discussions about jamming and everything, I would be remiss if I didn't put in the plug for my FCC buddies. In the U.S., the 1934 Communications Act actually gives the FCC jurisdiction for prosecuting and finding jammers and things like that in the U.S. And we talk a lot about, yes, you can find jammers for sale on the internet, but my FCC guys would want me to remind you that, A, it's illegal to buy a jammer or a spoofer. It's illegal to operate a jammer or a spoofer. It's illegal to sell a jammer or a spoofer. So the fact that these things are available is accurate, but it's also illegal, so just a safety tip out there.
That's a very important point.
I'll make a comment also on the INS, and I think it's one of the things that, we don't really appreciate sometimes, the beauty of GPS. So yeah, so before GPS, we were relying on INS systems. Those systems were large, power hungry, expensive. And still to this day, the expense and the accuracy of those is nowhere close to the level that we get on GPS. So I did mention there is a lot of research being done on trying to get IMUs that are much, much more accurate. As my colleague mentioned, though, you still need to know your initialization point. So those accelerometers and gyros, basically I'm going to dead reckon off of them, but I need an initial position. Also, the gravity models basically aren't accurate enough to be able to navigate. And so with GPS, I get position and time anywhere on the earth, anywhere in the world, for about $2 a chipset. And I get 5-meter positioning accuracy, and I get nanosecond time accuracy. And there is just no IMU. The IMUs that are in your cell phones will maintain that accuracy maybe for 30 seconds. And so that you can get that 24 hours a day anywhere on the globe, it is just unbelievably hard to meet that spec. And so that's why we become so reliant on it. And as was mentioned earlier, we went through the rollover back in '99, but there weren't nearly the number of systems. And one of the reasons is back then there was something called selective availability, which basically the GPS signal wasn't nearly the precision that it is now. And so there wasn't all of the reliance that has. So basically it became such a great source of position and time that I think, as was mentioned earlier, we never thought about all of the reliance on it. But yes, there are, people are looking to improve inertials, improve clocks, and so on and so forth as backups, as alternative means. But just to meet that, the spec that's provided by GPS is just nowhere near.
Great. All right, I think we're about at time, so, do we have one more question? All right.
Just a quick one. Are you concerned from a supply chain standpoint about a remote off switch in the capability of the chips? And likewise, the probability of malware propagation that would randomize the drift on the output of the signals from the receivers?
I would say with any technology system, malware, other cyber means of malfeasance are always a concern, and underlying everything that this is just one more piece of resilience, reliance that we need to think about in cyber terms. Again, making that evolution from being a radio signal to being an actual computer, subject to all of the vulnerabilities and risks that computer systems are subject to. Any thoughts?
No, I mean, I
Yeah,
think that sums it up really well.
I think it does.
Same concerns. You should have the same concerns for supply chain, et cetera, for your PNT systems that you do any other critical system.
I would throw, you should probably have that same concern with any modern car, because they're all hackable too.
Yep, true. All right. Well, thanks all of you, and thanks to my panelists today for a really, I think, robust and wide-ranging discussion on an important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.